And joining us now from his office in the Frost Block at Queen's Park, Ontario's Finance Minister Dwight Duncan, Liberal MPP for Windsor-Tecumseh. I'm always a little leery in doing these interviews because we're not till 8 o'clock, and I got to ask you, which number are we today?
Well, I've lost track, but you're probably about 20 or 25, Steve.
25, okay.
But this is the longest one and the most important one. As you know, I now have a tradition of wrapping up Budget Day with you.
And we appreciate your continuing that tradition with us. Let me start with this. You said in your budget papers today that you've, quote, recovered 91% of the jobs lost during the Great Recession. But I would observe this. The jobs that are back only pay a fraction of what the good-paying jobs that disappeared paid. So I wonder whether that statistic isn't a bit misleading.
Well, Stats Canada says about 84% of those are, in fact, full-time jobs. There is some debate around the issue of high-paying jobs versus lower-paying jobs. But anecdotally, there's considerable evidence that we're seeing growth in sectors of the economy with relatively high-paying jobs, although it's harder to nail that down. There's no doubt that some people who lost jobs will be working for less money. And that, by the way, in my view, is one of the reasons why we have to continue to show restraint. But I think, Steve, I take some satisfaction. For instance, last week it was announced that Toronto has gone from being the 12th largest financial center in the world to tied for 10th. In our financial services sector, we have high-paying jobs, high-skilled jobs. Today I had the opportunity to use the RIM playbook, which some of it is done overseas, but the high value-added jobs and the high skill level jobs are right here in Ontario across several companies in Waterloo, here in Toronto, as well as in Canada. And so I'm quite optimistic that we will see continued growth in high-paying, high-skilled jobs, and that's one of the reasons why we're investing still more today in post-secondary education.
And for what it's worth, people can go to my blog and see a picture of you with that playbook, which you did trot out today during your media lockup. That's true. Now let's talk about the two priorities you have in this budget, whether you can really, walk and chew gum at the same time. We are choosing, you said, to fight the deficit while protecting health and education at the same time. Now, it's an open question whether you really can do both at the same time. Convince us that you can.
Well, we have already. I mean, we've brought our deficits down from original projections of 24.7 way back in 2009. It's now down to $16.7 billion. We have been able to make investments, and we've also made some changes. For instance, in generic drugs last year, Steve, we changed the way we pay for generic drugs, which saved almost $500 million a year. We've got some other new initiatives we'll be bringing forward this year to find savings. But I think what's important is that overall we not lose the gains that we've made. And there will be some tough decisions. But in terms of frontline services, we want to focus on those. And in order to help us with that, we've also created a commission that's going to look at the public and broader public sectors. It'll be chaired by former economist with TD Bank, as well as a former senior official from the Department of Finance in Ottawa, a fellow I'm sure is known to many of your viewers, Don Drummond. He's just a terrific guy. He's given us a lot of good advice over the years on a range of issues, and we look forward to working with him as we move forward, protecting public health care and protecting our education systems.
Now, it is true, you are ahead of your deficit reduction targets. I got to give you that. But the targets you've set out in the future have you going from 16.7 this year to 16.3 billion to 15.2 billion. Now, would you call those ambitious efforts to reduce the deficit?
Well, next year, for instance, the federal government's deficit target actually goes up from what it originally projected. So does Quebec's, and Alberta has actually taken their forecast to balance out 1 year. What I'll say tonight is this, Steve. I fully expect we will see the deficit numbers come down further in the coming months, probably before the tabling of public accounts. The challenge I have as finance minister is I don't have the solid returns from last year's numbers yet to make that projection, though what we do know is that growth in the economy accelerated in the last quarter of last calendar year and the first quarter of this year. So I remain optimistic that the deficit will come in below where we're at now, but in fairness, and to be completely candid with Ontarians, that is the number that looks most reasonable right now, and we'll move forward in the future as numbers become available.
Well, if I'm reading between the lines, though, it sounds like you're agreeing that these are not particularly ambitious targets, though.
Well, I think they are ambitious, and I think we've actually, reduced our deficit from its peak by 32% versus the federal government, which has done it by 28%. I've exceeded our targets each and every year that we laid out. They're very cautious targets, but I think it's better to lay out cautious targets and then overachieve. And I think that I'm very optimistic that our plan is working and that it is going to continue to work well for the people of Ontario. Let
me ask you about the province's debt, because one of the things we learned today by reading the budget papers is that this province is now almost $250 billion, that's with a T, $250 billion in debt. And I wonder how concerned you are that we're carrying far too much.
Very concerned, and that's why we have to get back to balance. The only saving grace in all of this, Steve, is that governments around the world, including here in Canada, face similar challenges. Many governments went into huge stimulus spends, as we did. You know, that increased deficit can be directly related to a new range of new hospitals, new roads, other infrastructure projects that have been built or are being built. And so there is a real gain from that. That being said, your point is extremely well taken. I believe strongly that we need to develop a political consensus around debt reduction. I was pointing out to people today in the lockup and elsewhere that, you know, we've had 5 governments of 3 different political stripes in the last 21 years, so a generation. The NDP government doubled Ontario's debt. The Harris government raised it by, I think, 140 or 150% during huge boom time. We actually kept it pretty steady until the great downturn hit, but still, we've had to increase the debt. That being said, I think all of us need to come to terms with that and lay out a plan. And we have not heard a plan from either of the opposition parties. So we've laid out our plan. We've said we're going to get back to balance. We've said over what period of time. We've laid out some very specific cutbacks. We've also made some strategic investments in those areas that we think are important to a better economy in the future.
Your budget papers, though, Minister, also show that you're going to spend less money next year on Aboriginal affairs, less money on citizenship and immigration, less money on environment, less money on housing, less money on natural resources. Now, you're the guys who have come to office pledging to rebuild our public services, and yet those are cuts in some pretty significant ministries. How do you square that?
Well, we have, in fact, made significant investments in those ministries, and we have to do government different. We have to reform the way we do business. I laid out 21 ways in which we can do that today. There will be more to do in the future, but the fact is education and healthcare are this government's priority. Those are the 2 most important things, and I acknowledged today in the budget speech that, in fact, those priorities will, in fact, force us to do more, or do less, I should say, in the other ministries. But in order to help manage that, we're going to lay out a number of creative changes, creative ways of doing things so that people won't feel it, they won't see the frontline services. And my hope is that people like Mr. Hudak, the opposition leader, who says he'll get back to balance, likely wants to cut the HST, will explain to people just where he's going to get all that money.
No, I hear you. I mean, one of the things you said today is cutting the HST 1 point costs how much money?
$3 billion.
$3 billion.
Now, to put that in context for your viewers in Toronto, we could close every hospital on University Avenue and not get $3 billion. If you got rid of the entire OPP, you'd save about $1 billion. If you fired 33,000 nurses, you would get $3 billion. If you fired 12,000 doctors, you could get to $3 billion. We laid out a whole list of these things. Now, I agree that there's waste, and we always have to be vigilant about waste in any organization as big as the Ontario government and the broader public sector here in Ontario. There's going to be waste. But 70% of every dollar we spend goes to healthcare and education. So when you're talking about a deficit like we have, as well as a tax cut on the HST, you're talking about big money, and there's no way that you can get back to balance without cutting into the frontline services that families in Ontario want. They want better schools, better health care. And I believe Mr. Hudak will do exactly what he did when he was part of the Harris government. 3 weeks after getting elected, they cut money for education, they cut money for municipalities, and we think those were the wrong decisions, and we've laid out a plan that's very, very different from what I would call the Hudak-Harris approach, slash and burn, to getting back to balanced budgets.
Okay, Minister, I gave you a nice little soft one there in which you could expound on your Harris-Hudak line, which I know you're using a lot. So I get to ask you a mischievous one in return here, which is, you've always been a big supporter of Michael Ignatieff's. We know that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Still am.
okay. So what do you make of his plan to increase corporate taxes from 16.5% to 18%?
Well, first of all, Canada has cut its GST, which was probably one of the dumbest decisions any government ever made. I mean, they're just randomly cutting taxes without a plan. We have put together a tax plan for jobs and growth where we dealt with personal taxes, corporate taxes, and finally created the HST in Ontario. That wasn't easy, but the Conservative Party's leading expert on taxes has applauded our plan and says it will create 600,000 net new jobs.
But you're against corporate tax increases, right?
We compete against Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick for jobs. And our tax rate was 33% higher on corporations. So we brought our tax rate down. I think what Mr. Ignatieff's saying is quite consistent with what we're saying. What he is saying is we've already cut corporate taxes in Canada, and that now's the time to put a pause on it. You know what? Our situation is different from the federal situation. Our corporate tax rates around the world are comparable, or about mid-range in the OECD. And frankly, Mr. Ignatieff could put the argument that what Ontario's done could allow the federal government, in fact, to pause on its stuff on corporate taxes because we're 40% of the Canadian economy. So I think it's a good plan. You know, people missed a few things in Mr. Flaherty's budget. Number one, they're projecting the deficit to increase next year. Number two, the parliamentary budget officer says they've only got a 16% chance of balancing their budget in the timeline they said they would. And three, Mr. Ignatieff and we agree on a number of things. We agree on the importance of education and health care. So I'm a proud supporter of Michael Ignatieff, a proud supporter of the Federal Liberal Party, and my hope is that it'll be Mr. Ignatieff that we're negotiating the Canada Health Accord with, and not Mr. Harper, who I fear will really gut health care, not only here in Ontario, but across the country.
Mr. Duncan, he needs more friends like you. That was as good a save as I've seen in a long time. Dwight Duncan, Minister of Finance, it's good of you to join us on TVO on Budget Day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.